Welcome to our fifth talk in our series, our Eleanor William Hooker Tea Talks, and I'm really excited to see everybody here today. We had an awesome one last week at a different location, if you were there, and today we're looking at issues that are an issue that is really on the forefront right in our current political situation. And we hope that through this dialogue that we will have, we'll all leave with a better understanding of each other, where we've come from, what we're doing, and hopefully where we're going in a way to make this a much more perfect union than it is at the moment. So, my name is Jerri-Anne, and I'm the director for the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. And with me is Sandy Clark.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see everybody out.
Good afternoon.
I'm Sandy Clark, and I'm president of the Seacoast African American Cultural Center. Before we get started, what I'd like to do is, to ask a few people, if you wouldn't mind, like, turning to the person next to you, 2 to 3 people in a group, try to talk to someone that you don't know, and introduce yourself and share. When you think about what you know about being Muslim in the United States, where has that information come from? What are some of the type of questions as we begin today? So if you take a few minutes just to do that, introduce yourself to someone next to you. Okay, did we learn a lot from the person next to you? There'll be a test later.
So our tea talk is going to be a little bit different today, our format, as you can see with our opening. And we have a special moderator today, Michelle Holt-Shannon from New Hampshire Listens, and she'll tell you a little bit about that before she starts. And we're really excited to have our panelists here today who will share their stories. I won't go into their biographies because you have them with you to save time and leave a lot of space for dialogue. But we have Sama Adargi. Now, I practiced it before.
It's the microphone.
I know.
That's the way I practice.
Robert Azi, Rashida Mohammed, and we have another panelist who's just a little bit delayed, and he'll be with us, Dauda Dieng, shortly. So I'll pass it on over. The format is Michelle will take over, with the discussions. The panelists will have a few minutes to make their remarks, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So the questions you have that you just talked about, see how they changed after we get into a dialogue, and then we'll see where we go from there. Great.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. I will be your humble moderator, and I'm excited to hear more about each of you. So thanks for being here and sharing your stories with us. My name is Michelle Holt-Shannon, and I help run New Hampshire Listens. We're out of the Carsey School of Public Policy at UNH, and we're very concerned about public life and the decisions we make as public, communities, as governments, as organizations. And so New Hampshire Listens tries to be a bridge between groups when communities are stuck. And so that's the work that I do. Happy to talk more about that some other day. But I think one of the things that we can do is we'll ask, to just hear a little bit from each of you just to help us get started and have a sense of who you are and being with us today. I have a few questions just to kind of get us started, and then we'll open it up to folks in the room and go from there. Does that sound okay? Sure. All right. Rashida, do you mind starting for us? Okay.
do you want me to introduce myself, or are you going to start with the questions?
So I have a few questions. If you came prepared with a few initial remarks,
We
can do that, but I also
we will
can
go
start
with your
with the
questions.
okay, all right, sounds good. So my first question, and when you answer the first question, welcome. I'll let you breathe. My first question, and you can just share a little bit about yourself when you answer this first one, is what are some of the core beliefs of Islam that are most important and central to you? So in terms of how you live your life and live Islam, what are some of those core beliefs that are most central?
My name is Rashida Mohammed. I work for Manchester Police Department. I'm originally from Sudan. I came to the United States with my husband and my 2 daughters. My core belief of the Islam that we are collectively together, all of us as a human being created by the good creator. And we all going to go to the judgment individually, and we deal with our deeds. Bad or good, whoever can say that, and that's actually the belief that created for me issue with my family as a father who has a mosque attached to the house and a community that's believe in Islam as the final religion, and we all have to be the Muslims that we will meet in heaven, wherever that is. And I believe we all as a human being, as much as we practice our belief individually and we do no harm to no one, then the Creator will be the judgment for our doing.
Thank you. Robert?
I'd like to preface it with something that I actually a little story I wanted to tell as we enter into this dialogue. Several years ago, the people of Stockholm, Sweden, were debating about building a Mormon temple in Stockholm. And most of the good citizens of Stockholm were opposed to the Mormons building this edifice in their midst. So Bishop Christer Stendahl, who was one of the giants of Lutheran theology, flew to Stockholm and gave a speech in defense of the Mormon temple. And in that speech, he enunciated 3 principles of religious understanding, which I think we should keep in mind today as we have this discussion. In fact, I think we should keep them in mind all the time. The first is, don't judge a religion. Don't compare your best with their worst. Secondly, if you want to know about a religion, ask one of its adherents, not one of its critics. And the third one, which I hope we can all find on both sides of this table today, leave a little room for holy envy. Part of my understanding of holy envy is my understanding that we are created, as the Quran tells us, we are created a diverse people so that we may know each other. That if we had wanted to all be one, God would have created us all one. And I think life would have been very boring had it been so. We're given the challenge of what we do with this responsibility of being on earth. And we have this phrase in Arabic, comes from the Quran, the Ahl al-Kitab, people of scripture, or people of the book. And that includes the Torah, it includes the Gospels, it includes the Psalms, it includes the Quran. It's an inclusiveness of people who both serve God and are committed to serving their fellow man. And I think that's what guides us all to be here.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, I should introduce myself. I'm Robert Azzi. Thank you.
Thank you to Jerri-Anne and her collaborators for putting this event together. That's okay. That's all right. I understand. It's got a life of its own. My name is Samab Abdur-Rakib. I live in Portland, Maine. I've lived in Maine for since 2010. Moved there for a job and then decided to stay there. I spent most of my life in the Midwest, and perhaps that might become relevant later. Okay, so the question about what kind of core tenets of Islam are most important to me, I will say two things. One, I'll talk about how I approach my faith, which core tenets are important to me in terms of my faith. And then I'll talk about how I try to live my life. So in terms of my faith, there are 5 pillars of Islam. Maybe we can talk about them later. But 2 that are most important to me are prayer. We're supposed to, we're asked to pray 5 times a day. Sometimes that is easy, sometimes that is difficult. But that is important to me because that is about my relationship with God and taking time out of my day to work on that relationship. The other is giving zakat, which is giving charity, which to me is a moment for me to, is always an opportunity for me to not think of self and to think of others. And that, to me, that again brings me closer to God. And in terms of how I live my life, I actually want to pick up on the verse that Robert alluded to. So there's a verse in the Quran that talks about we made you from one people and we divided you into nations, into tribes so that you may know one another. The most closest to God or the most honorable is those who are pious and those who do righteous deeds, righteous work. There's also the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his last sermon, there's a part in his last sermon where he talks about that basically that there is no one there is not a non-Arabs are not superior to Arabs. Arabs are not superior to non-Arabs. White folks aren't superior to black folks. Black folks aren't superior to white folks. And again, the kind of idea that those who are closest to God are those who are most pious and most righteous. And so I do a lot of work that we would probably call social justice work. Right now in my life, in my paid work, I work for the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, but I do a lot of organizing in my life outside of work, and I use those two, that verse and that the quote from that sermon to drive my kind of activism and my organizing, recognizing that not just that we are one people, but recognizing that there are these divisions that exist, and those divisions also often result in oppression, and it is my duty to fight against that oppression.
Thank you. Diana?
Hello, my name is Dauda Jiang. I wish everybody in here with the Muslim greeting of peace. I wish peace upon all of you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. Originally from the New Hampshire area, southern New Hampshire. My parents are my father's from Senegal, West Africa. My mom is from Germany. And as far as the question, what Islam means to me and some of the, most basic tenet that I can go to would be what we call the Shahada, which is what every Muslim conveys, or I don't know if that's the best word, but every Muslim follows. And if somebody was to convert or revert back to Islam, you say La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, which basically just means that there's one God, and that is Allah, and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last and final prophet. And that's basically what we believe. I think that a lot of people don't know that Islam is one of the Abrahamic religions, and that if studied with an open mind, most people would find that it very much has a lot in common. Most things in common with Judaism and Christianity. And with all world religions, that we all want to do good things. We all want to be good people. We want what's best, and we want peace. And it's just, this is our formula and what we believe is the best way to go about it. But as was stated, we are absolutely taught that we are all humans first, you know, and that's one thing that I definitely try to pay attention to. And what Islam does for me is, you know, by having spirituality in my life, it reminds me, and I'm sure many of us can relate, regardless of the faith, that there's a higher power, you know, and that we are not the highest power. And, you know, I think with the technology advances and things like that, I think a lot of us are getting arrogant, you know, as a human race. So I think that kind of keeps me humble. It helps keep me humble, helps keep us humble. And remember that, you know, you can't make something out of nothing, you know. There was a creator. That's what we believe. So that's what it does for me, and it helps me keep things in perspective. So, you know, nothing is ever too, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah the Most High will never give us something that we can't handle, you know, and that's, that helps me keep that in perspective, knowing that there's a higher power, knowing that, you know, we're not the highest, and that, and yeah, it just keeps things in perspective. So that's the biggest thing for me.
Thank you.
I would say.
We're going to stick with you a little bit longer, and have you each sort of say a little bit about how some of your other identities intersect with yourself in terms of race, in terms of gender, other identities that are important to you that have these intersections with Islam and being Muslim in the United States, and a few things about what that means. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, as I stated, I come from a very diverse background. I was born in the U.S. Both my parents and most of my family is from Senegal and Germany. And then most of them live there. So we always had a very tight-knit group. I really have only my, you know, direct family that live here. And so growing up, establishing an identity, especially living in New England, where especially when I was younger, I didn't see many people that looked like me, you know, and establishing an identity was something that was a real struggle in my life. And Islam has been able to give me an identity above just cultural or racial or anything like that. It gives me a different, a very inclusive identity. But matching those other identities like culture and things like that is not difficult in Islam, because it's absolutely, as was stated, all-inclusive. We have Muslims from every race, every culture, and as was stated also, you know, we ask that, you know, when taking a look, try to take a look not necessarily at the people, and that's for everything, not just at the people, but at the belief, you know, because we're not perfect, none of us are, and yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I am Black. I'm African American. My parents converted to Islam before they met each other. This is the story, that they converted before they met each other in a bookstore in New York City. So, you know, I was born in New York City, and then we shortly thereafter moved to Ohio. My parents converted at a time, you know what, yeah, they converted in the late 60s at a time where, you know, where at the tail end of the civil rights movement, there were a lot of Black folks who were searching to forge new religious identities that were that felt more liberating than Christianity. I think that my parents have two different conversion paths, but in some part that was important to them. So I'm saying all that to, you know, to say that I was raised in a very Black conscious household, and so for me, my identity as a Black person is not separate from my Muslim identity. There's a very long history of Islam in the Black community that dates back to slavery, and so my parents instilled that in me. I think that, so I'm thinking about my identity as a woman and what it means to be a woman practicing Islam, and I think that honestly that I didn't think more concretely about that until I actually left the house. Not to say that, I think that I was kind of covertly raised in a feminist household. My mother was a very strong, figure in my life, and taught me Black feminism in ways that were not necessarily overt. But I think that it wasn't until I got to college and I started to study a little bit more about Islam, and then it kind of made the decision that this is the path that I want to, this is the path that I want. When you're growing up and you're raised in the house and you're kind of like, this is the path of my parents, and so I kind of follow that path. But I made the decision when I went to college, and I started to learn more about Islam and the rights that it gave women historically at a time when women didn't have rights. During the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and shortly after, and that I remember that being a very empowering moment to me, particularly in the face of folks who tend to think that Islam oppresses women. Okay, yeah, that's what I'm going to say about that. We'll probably keep talking about these things.
Great, thank you.
Islam's been here for 400 years. We know that in fact, we know that Muslim slaves arrived the year before the Mayflower did. But for most Americans, there was no understanding that they were Muslims in their midst until 9/11, when they sort of appeared like Topsy, because Muslims had been so assimilated into the American fabric. They were Americans like everyone else. The religion was private, and in the public space they were participating as everyone else was. And they were forced by circumstance, or circumstances forced upon them, this divide between the other and the Americans, if you will. And being Muslim became the code word for the other. I mean, they did it after 9/11. They certainly did it at the time of when Obama was running for office, and he was identified as Kenyan, as other, as Muslim, as somehow foreign. And then, as I've written, during the election cycle, there was a particular candidate who decided to draw a crescent on my back along with a target as a way to ascending to power. So Islam has become the sort of central point for me in this intersection between privilege and oppression and the responsibility and what's the word I'm looking for here, and that I can say in mixed company. Well, let's just say the Muslims are the intersection. How Muslims are treated, how Muslims identify themselves, and how they're identified by the general public, basically is identifying the difference between, if you will, white privilege and white rights, and the rights and oppression of minority communities and communities of color, religions in this country. And so, if we're talking about the intersectionality of things, for me, that's the center. It's where the violence is occurring. It's where the oppression is occurring. It's where new kinds of red lines are occurring. And so, to be Muslim at that time, at this time, is both difficult and, for me, a source of pride as well, that we can establish an identity based on justice and rights. I find just in the words of two people who I admire a lot, Hamid Dabashi, an Iranian scholar at Columbia, who wrote in an editorial how he, in some ways, wanted to thank Donald Trump for forcing him to be public in his identity as a Muslim, because he never had to do that before. And Fareed Zakaria, who's a bit too conservative for me occasionally on CNN. But again, for a man who hasn't been to a mosque in generations, has, by virtue of the political dialogue in this country, it stands up and says, that is who I am. And it's a question of, there's a time in our history where we have to say, this is what we are, and this is who we are, and this is what we stand for.
Thank you. Rashida?
So for me, it's my gender. I believe in the 5 cores of the Islam, which is, to say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, which the God is the creator, and the Prophet Muhammad, be peace on him, is the prophet from God. And to pray my prayer, and to do the fasting, and to pay for zakat or charity, and to do the pilgrimage if I can afford it. And then there is a lot of interpretations coming from the hadith, which, that was written for the Prophet when the Islam was started, or the different interpretation. And that's just opened so many doors to so many different interpretations. And that's always took me to debates in my family with my fellow Muslims, and it challenged me, but only I think because of my gender, because I'm a female, and that became, as you can see, I'm not color, and the interpretation or the reason that was given to me, why should I just don't believe it. I don't think that I am responsible for any male erection because of my hair. That's just not my responsibility. And I say that, and I went in debate with that. I born lefty. I have no control over that, right? So might be because my brain in the other side. So I think what challenged me in my religion is my gender. And growing up with 9 siblings, big house, and big family, and a father who has a mosque attached to the house. So I'm the girl that's, her father preached and talk, and people come and pray after him, yet she's not covered. Doesn't mean I'm not. Doesn't mean, I'm not a good Muslim, or I believe I'm a good human being. I'm who I am. And my religion, it's mine and mine only. And the door is open for interpretation. And it doesn't mean theirs right and mine is wrong, or vice versa. So I think my gender has a big role in the way I practice, and the way the interpretation in some verses in the Quran or in the Sunnah or Hadith that came from the Prophet for women. And that's the challenge I have with my religion.
Thank you. So we'll stick with you. We'll do one more round.
Okay.
What do you worry about?
What do I worry about?
Traffic.
All right, I worry about, and this is because on March 8th, Women's National Day, I have a group, a family WhatsApp group they just, text messaging, we all over the world, and, they send messages and religious things and debates and all of that. So on that day, I woke up, and my aunt, she usually sent a saying from the Muslim calendar about something from the Quran or something from the religion. And that day, it said a hadith that the interpretation for it is the majority of people in hell are women. And it just took me to the roof. It's like, why? What did we do? I had no choice of being born with a vagina. I didn't choose that. So we went, and that's what worries me, that I will, by my religion, I would be punished by having a vagina. And that's what worries me.
Thank you. Robert, over to you after that one.
I think I've been set up. But actually, I think it's really interesting. And I think you're absolutely right. I think Islam, like the other two monotheistic religions that preceded it, fell victim over the centuries to the abuse of patriarchy. That I think in Islam's tafsir, or the exegetical understanding of Islam for over 1400 years, all the tafsir, all the understanding has been written by men. Not only has it been written by men, for men, but it's actually been written to empower men and empower men's control over not only women, but also over people who they deem to be not as literate in the religion as they are, the sort of patriarchs. So it's a real challenge, and if you haven't read it already, I refer you to Asma Balas, who has written a book called Believing Women in Islam, which is a great opening to this. What I worry about is two things. Number one, I worry about violence. I have mentored over the years and continue to mentor some young people, and I know 3 families that have now left the country since the election. 2 to Canada and 1 back to Pakistan. And I could not assure them, as much as I said you should stay because this is where the battle is, but I could not assure them of their safety. I know another family in Los Angeles, a South African family, where the woman has been mahajaba, or covered, her entire life. And recently, to fly to visit friends in Florida, the woman, on her own, not advised by her husband, decided to take off her headscarf to fly. And this is a woman in her mid-60s, and for the first time in her life, she was so much in fear that she took off her hijab. And I find it difficult, as a country that I was born in and raised in, that we can create such sectarian fear and hatred and division in this country that people are forced to renounce, either in words or acts or some sort of act of omission, freedoms that, our founding fathers set up for us, in which if we just followed the path, that woman wouldn't have to be taking off her job. The other families wouldn't have to be leaving, and I wouldn't be the recipient, every time I write a column in the Portsmouth Herald or Concord Monitor, of receiving really nasty, ugly emails from a bunch of troglodytes and trolls, none of which are here because they fear daylight. But the point is that there is a really nasty underground. I fear the underground. I fear the some sort of new iteration of the KKK rising its head, out of ignorance, and that's where we have to stand and challenge, and that's where I think the 4 of us have chosen to be here today.
Thank you.
So the KKK is here. They've been flying in cities surrounding Portland. So they're here. They've always been here, and so that is like as in flying a few weeks ago. It is a very tangible threat where I live. I fear a couple of things, but honestly, so I want to pick up on what Robert said about violence, and honestly, I for whatever reason, I don't fear for myself, mostly because I am privileged to be, born here, have citizenship, and so I don't think about the way that the threat of deportation affects friends that I have in Maine and across the country. And for whatever reason, I live in a very, Portland is diverse for for where it is, but the rest of Maine is very rural and very white. And I travel a lot for my job, and in those moments, I don't necessarily I don't necessarily register the fear bodily, but it is kind of always there, like this idea that I go into places and because I'm marked by difference, then there's the potential for confrontation, but it doesn't register bodily usually. I guess the other thing that I fear is the violence that's committed in the name of my religion. Honestly, that for me, that's something that that happens over in other countries, but it is something that I feel regularly because it is not just that it is chaotic and without reason, but it is chaotic without reason and brutal, and it is justified in the name of God, and I find that that's just abhorrent, and it is terrifying to me. Those are things I fear.
Okay, just to touch real briefly, one great thing that I would say that gives me a lot of hope is what was stated, that we in Islam are encouraged to debate. We're encouraged to seek knowledge and seek our own truth. We're encouraged to ask questions. And yes, along the way, humans who are not perfect stifle that. And for instance, with women's rights, we're accused of a lot of things, and that's not to say that there are Muslims that do horrible things to women. But to keep it in perspective, I think that is not just an Islamic thing. I think women have been struggling for a long time and suffering for a long time all around the world, all faiths, all races, and we're not exempt from that. But I just ask people to keep in mind that those things are usually cultural first. For instance, female genital mutilation, for instance. That's primarily, for instance, an East African problem. And you'll see Christians do that, Muslims do that, but unfortunately propaganda has been aiming at us, lately, That's just one example. But you go to, most places in West Africa, North Africa, women there, they haven't even heard of that. Malaysia, haven't even heard of that. And keep in mind, only, people think of Islam, they think of Arabic people. Arabic people really only make up about 15% of the religion. There's about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world right now. So I guess in media they say if it doesn't bleed, what bleeds leads. I don't remember exactly what it is, but something along that. If it's not juicy, they don't. We all know that it's not really going to make the headlines. People don't necessarily want to hear about the good stuff going on all the time. So I just want to keep that in context. And having two daughters, 9 and 5 years old, I make sure that I'm a very positive influencer as best as I can be, and I want them to feel absolutely empowered. And in Islam, I was taught that women are equal, but we're not the same. That's just the way it is. That doesn't mean that we are supposed to treat each other worse or take advantage of whatever abilities that we've given. And I believe that God Almighty has given us each abilities that can help us or give us some troubles. That's one thing. Just the fact that I think we are supposed to, we are free to interpret the religion as it comes, and we also believe that it is a religion that is for all times and all people. And one of the miracles of it is that as time goes, the interpretations do somewhat change on some things. The basic principles don't change, but some things do change, and the person that is interpreting it absolutely has a lot to do with that, and like was stated, a lot of these interpretations and translations were, were coming from the people that were in power, at the time, which a lot of times were men, and were from, cultures and societies that were very oppressive towards women. So I think that right now, we as a society are very ill and very sick. I think that whatever religion you are or not, I think we all can kind of agree that there's something missing. And a lot of that, I think, is a lack of, of spirituality personally. That helps me a lot, I know. And I think a lot of values have just gone, out the window. But
Say a little bit about what you worry about.
what I'm worried about, those are some of the things that I worry about. I'm partially worried about it, just to touch on that. But what I personally worry about is, ignorance. That I think that for a long time, especially my generation, was very asleep. Were not active in any kind of things that were going on, and I think that's one of the biggest silver linings of what's going on right now is that people are waking up and paying attention to what's going on, politics and all kind of things like never before. So that actually gives me hope. And I think fear a lot of times is actually healthy, and it actually causes us to act, fight or flight, things like that. As long as it's a healthy fear, because my belief in God Almighty, I believe that He's a loving God, and that good will prevail. And I think that it has in the past, otherwise we'd be extinct. And that's what happens. Evil is there, yes, but good will prevail. So I use the fear actually as a hope. And I think that every group that ever came to this country, by the way, has gone through some things like this. So this is actually, there's some good signs in this, whether it's the Italian immigrants or the whatever immigrant group has gone through oppression at first. And after they got through that, they've become just like any other American in this group. And so hopefully that's what that means right now.
Great, thank you. So in a second, we're going to open it up for your questions. But my next question, to start back with you, Judah, is what are some of the questions that you get from others that reveal some of the biggest misconceptions of Islam?
Oh, well, where do I start?
Before we give you our questions.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just the highlights where people try to take, like one little line out of the Quran, for instance, and, take it completely and don't give any context. And, just I think the big things like women's rights, violence, the things that people are afraid of right now. And, but the biggest battle, the biggest weapon to all of that is what we're doing right now, is opening dialogue and for people to get to know one another and just talk. I think same thing like in the civil rights movement, being black, not during that time, but growing up, mixed black, I've had to deal with a lot of that type of issue. And I always said that people are afraid of what they don't know. So one of the best things that I've ever done is just show people, hey, I'm a Muslim, I'm black, but I'm a normal person just like anybody else. And I think that if you get to know us, that's what anybody will find out, as long as you come with an open mind.
Thank you.
Okay, so before I speak to the questions, I just want to affirm what Rashida brought up in terms of Islam being oppressive to women, or this perception. I think that, as Dawda said, there is, people use religion to oppress women for years, for always, right? But I think that there has to be an acknowledgement that there are verses in the Quran, and there are parts in Hadith that are at face value can be problematic, and I think that we can't just deny that they exist and just say, Islam doesn't, Islam is not problematic for women. I think you need to acknowledge that, and then you need to have a conversation about that. And there are lots of folks who've written. Barlas's book is great. She's done a translation of the Quran. The more women who are coming out as Islamic scholars. Amina Wadud is excellent. She writes about gender in the Quran and gender in Islam. The more people you have kind of debating this, but not shying away from it and kind of saying, let's not look at it, let's pretend it doesn't exist, because it's true, and that is, and people use those verses to do violence to women, to silence women's voices, to keep them away from their faith and from their religious texts. And so I just wanted to confirm that. All right, so questions. So the weird thing about living in New England, I've been in New England for 6 years, is that people don't ask me anything. And so, you know, Jerri-Anne provided some questions for us to think about, and that was one of the questions. What do people ask you? And when I lived in the Midwest, I was raised in Ohio, went to grad school in Wisconsin, and I got questions all the time. I think that something interesting happens when I moved to Maine. So Maine is, as many of you probably know, it's a resettlement location. We have a lot of folks from lots of different countries. Somalia is, we have many refugees, immigrants from Somalia, so you have a large Somali population. And I think that there's an assumption made that I am Somali, and whatever, you know, people have assumed I'm many things, you know. People have asked me if I was Nigerian, people have asked me all sorts of things. And in general, like that erasure of like black history and Islamic history, that usually doesn't bother me necessarily. I think that what happens in Maine is that there's a really fervent need to affirm the presence of immigrant folks, because, I mean, you know, before I moved to Maine, there was this lovely letter that the mayor of Lewiston wrote to his Somali immigrants. I think it was like 2005. This was like way before I moved to Maine, before I even knew that Maine was a thing. Like I hadn't conceptualized Maine. But he wrote this letter to Somali immigrants and told them to stop coming, because, you know, it was full of xenophobic stuff, but the premise was that we just can't take any more of you, our economy can't handle any more of you. And so there's just this need to affirm the presence of immigrants, and with our current administration, there are constantly rallies and protests happening that say, we welcome immigrants, we welcome you here. And so I'm not exactly sure, I've just been thinking about this today, I think that what that means is that people make an assumption that I'm Somali, that they don't want to question me because they don't want to, and I'm talking like liberal white folks, like not like, you know, people who are hostile, like liberal white folks don't want to question me because they don't want that to make it seem like they invalidating my presence there. So I seriously don't get asked any questions. I think that when I first moved to Maine, this is a random story, but when I first moved to Maine and I decided, like, I'm gonna try the online dating scene, which I don't advise that anyone ever do. But that is where I would get the questions. That is where I would get and usually they were things about gender that I just am like, you know, when I first moved to Maine, I taught at a liberal arts college, and I remember somebody asking me like, oh, you're Muslim, are you allowed to do that? And I just, like, those kinds of questions I don't even have any tolerance for, because all you have to do is just look at either women who wear hijab, Muslim women who wear hijab, doing all sorts of things all over the internet. Just, you can Google that. But in general, I don't get like really substantive questions that will start a dialogue. And I don't know, I'm just thinking about that. So I'm excited about this back and forth.
Well, I get a lot of questions. Are we allowed to answer the questions that we say that we've been asked? Or we just put the questions out there? One of the truly offensive questions I get, and if you're in the audience and you're one of the people that asked me this question once at the Portsmouth Library, I won't identify you by name, but I was asked if I condemn terrorism. We were talking about a specific incident in Orlando, and did I condemn it? And I said, you know, this is a burden that... I did a piece once for CBS Sunday Morning, and it was entitled, "Please God, Don't Let It Be a Muslim." And that's sort of the prayer of every Muslim in this country every time there's an act of violence. And that happened to be after the Boston Marathon bombing. And so I said, how many of you woke up and said, please God, don't let it be a Christian, when Dylan Roof shut up those people at Mother Emanuel Church? And how many people said, please God, don't let it be a Christian, when the shooter attacked the Planned Parenthood Center in Colorado Springs? To ask me to sort of condemn it is somehow to make an assumption that I own it, that it's somehow native to me, that it's part of me, and that you somehow want to associate that kind of violence and that kind of terror with Islam in a way that you're unwilling to ascribe it to other religions or to other peoples. And I find that really offensive. So I suggest to you, don't ask me that question tonight. Or any of us. One of the most common questions I get, and I think it comes in part because we have a bunch of troglodytes in the state legislature who want to legislate to ban Sharia from the New Hampshire Constitution, and that no one can act on Sharia law. First of all, whoever is offering such a bill means that they've never read Article 12 of the U.S. Constitution, where no other law can supersede the American law or Constitution. And secondly, it means they know nothing about Sharia, and they haven't made any attempt to learn. And actually, I'm just going to put it there because my co-panelists may agree or disagree, but I just want to lay it out there, and you can think about it as you form your questions. And this is the argument that I've come up with about what is Sharia. And actually, I find the phrase Sharia law a little bit of a misnomer. For me, Sharia law is like the American Declaration of Independence. It's aspirational. You find it in the Quran, and it speaks of liberty, it speaks of justice, it speaks of equality, it speaks of all the aspirations of mankind, not just the Muslims. A Saudi friend says it basically speaks of lowercase Muslims, small m Muslims, and the capital Muslims are the people that actually, follow the tenets of faith. But the Sharia is the aspiration, what God inspires us and wants to inspire us to be as human beings, both in service to God and to service to man. And then fiqh, F-I-Q-H, for those of you taking notes, is Islamic law. And that is the attempts by humans who are fallible, because we're human, to try to find in some legislative form or legal form an understanding of what we're being asked in the Quran. And people make mistakes. Sometimes they're asking someone to do a judgment in fiqh, in Islamic law, and it's sort of like asking Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia. Depending where you are and what time you are, you could have a very conservative opinion, and you could have a very progressive and liberal opinion. But that Islamic law is separate from what and we're bound by Islamic law in the jurisdictions wherever we choose to be. But it's something different. It's something different than Sharia. And so I ask you, they're still in session. If Ken Wilder of Kingston or Lou D'Alessandro, whatever his name, not D'Alessandro, the guy who worked for Trump, the Veterans Affairs guy. If they're in your jurisdiction, vote against them, please, because they serve no one but themselves.
Thank you.
I think for me, the most question is, do I really work for the police department? And sometimes if I send a letter with my title and my name, and people wouldn't call my number, they will call and ask if this is a fake or it's real. That's now in the police department we have Muhammad. That's work there. So I think my appearance doesn't give them much about my religion, but my last name. And of course that's at the airport or wherever I have to present my ID, and people will look and like, oh, second look. Like, really? So that's mostly what I've been challenged by.
All right. Thank you. So I don't think we have a mic in the back, but what I'll do is I'll repeat the question, and I would love to hear from some of you if you have a few questions that you want to ask our panel. Yes.
For Mr. Aziz, you spoke of, Judy Gash in her book, Daughters of the Dust, spoke about the African slaves that were brought to the Sea Islands and never were exposed to Christianity or to, the mainland United States. They went on to practice Islam because they never had the exposure. But could you talk a little bit about historically about Islam in the United States?
Yes, did everyone hear the question? Speak a little bit about Islam historically in the United States. Roughly 1/3, or perhaps as many as 1/3 of the slaves that were brought to the United States were Muslim. Many sold into slavery by Muslim slave traders. Everyone was participating in this really sort of pernicious trade in humankind. Many of the slave owners tried to convert, either through reason, not often, because by virtue of being a plantation owner, you weren't a very reasonable person, but often by force to convert their slaves to Christianity. They were seen as less than human. They were seen as property. And only recently, in the last couple of decades, you can now find records at Davidson College, at Duke, at the University of North Carolina. There are records of early Muslims who tried to hold on to their religion, who actually wrote, there's a Risala by a guy named Bilal, that's at Davidson College. There's a whole body of research now being done in the slave, in the community of slaves that was converted to Christianity, and there were those who tried to hold on to it. There were those that have returned to it. Karim Abdul-Jabbar makes reference to the slave owning days when he converted to Islam, and gave up his slave name, Lou Elsendor. Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali, whose son just yesterday, for the second time, was stopped at the airport, and he's a native-born American citizen. But Cassius Clay was the only person so punished as a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, because he was the only Muslim that asked at the time to have CO status. But roughly 1/3, I think, of the Muslims in the United States today are African American Muslims. And as Ibtihaj Muhammad said, shortly after she won not the gold medal, but an Olympic medal in fencing, that she was so upset by this Muslim ban because, in part, she has no place to go. Her roots are deeper back in America than most Americans have roots back in America. So this is just a quick story. Cotton Mather, the infamous Cotton Mather of the Salem witch trials, was given a slave as a present by his congregation when he took over a church in 1706 in Boston. And Cotton Mather named him Onesimus. And Onesimus actually introduced Cotton Mather to the idea of inoculations and was actually instrumental in helping to stop a smallpox break in the middle of the 18th century in Boston. But finally, Cotton Mather made Onesimus buy his freedom because Onesimus refused to convert from Islam to Christianity. So he, a pox on you, I don't want you in my household anymore. But Onesimus was bound to carry water and firewood for him and shovel snow for the rest of his life, even in his freedom.
I just want to add to that because you bring up Daughters of the Dust, which if no one has seen Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, is a beautiful, beautiful film. And so there's that character whose name is, I think, Bilal. I actually can't remember right now. I'm terrible at remembering names of people. But he, it looks at Daughters of the Dust follows a family in the Gullah Islands, and there's a character, I think his name is Bilal, who is Muslim. And he practices Islam. This is shortly after slavery, and he practices Islam. And he is someone who I think is what we in Islam would call Hafiz, which means that he's memorized the entire Quran. And so there were many, many slaves who were Muslim who came over who were Hafiz, who had memorized the Quran, and that is how they were able to hold on to their religion as there were white slave owners who were attempting to convert them. I think that the first evidence of the first written Quran, evidence of that, I don't remember where it is right now, but it was written by a black slave. So there's that. Thank you for bringing up Daughters of the... I love that movie. It's beautiful. In addition to slaves, there's also, the history of Islam that goes to the black community that there's Sunni Muslims, and then there are folks who identify as the Nation of Islam. There are folks who identify as 5%ers, that kind of thing. There's just, I don't know, that's just a continued kind of lineage.
Explain 5%ers.
Oh, I don't know that I can, actually.
Okay.
I don't know that I can, but yeah, I don't know that I can. I don't know all their what they believe.
Okay.
So earlier reference was made very briefly to liberation through conversion in the 60s, particularly in the 60s in the US. And 20 years ago when I studied in South India, a number of Hindus who were born into the Dalit society, so the so-called untouchable society, were converting out of Hinduism, which sanctioned casteism. Originally they were converting to Christianity, hoping to attain liberation through conversion. When that was not found to be very helpful, they then started converting to Islam, and they found that through Islam there was a brotherhood. People in the community were willing to support them, and they achieved a certain level of liberation through conversion. And I was just wondering whether here and now, so here in the North, and now there are people who are converting to Islam in order to seek some sort of liberation or justice.
Yeah, I would like to say something on that briefly. That is, again, I was talking about silver linings, and I do get asked questions, and even if I don't get asked the questions directly, I hear the questions. What maybe not directly at a Muslim, but maybe amongst non-Muslims or on the media and things like that. But so one silver lining is that the negativity and the propaganda is not being believed by everybody. A lot of people know better. They hear that and they say that can't be true, that all of these people are really like this. So that causes people to be curious and ask questions, and it actually gives me the chance to do what we call da'wah, which is basically just spreading our beliefs to the masses and to people. Basically, we believe there's no compulsion in religion, so I don't want to say like we're trying to get somebody, convert people, but it's basically explaining our religion and being open to talk about it, type of thing. So a lot of people have actually converted in the military and all kind of places that you would not expect, and from all kind of races. So that's one great part of everything that's going on right now. But as far as liberation all over, I definitely do feel an incredible brotherhood. And when I say brother, I mean, I have sisters as well, in Islam. And what, again, like what I said before, is that it's a brotherhood that goes above and beyond race and culture and all those type of things. And I think any group that is feeling oppressed at a time, there's kind of a galvanization that occurs, and actually a strengthening that occurs as well. So so those are some of the benefits that I think has happened, if that answers your question at all.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
I think that there are people drawn not just to Islam, but to people who have lost their roots through alcohol, through drugs, through problems with their family, through loss of job, who sometimes are drawn to a particular religion or a particular force because of the rules, because it gives them a structure. And it's very tempting, and I think we all need to be careful. It's something I'm vigilant in when I talk to people about Islam, or people who are thinking about converting, for example, that I want them to be drawn, if they're drawn, not by the rules, because rules give us no growth or flexibility, but by belief in beauty and justice. And I think there, in some gangs, in some prisons, and even we see in ISIS or Daesh, we see in these groups, they behave less like religious communities and more like cults. And their behavior is defined by rules of hierarchy, and they're as oppressive within their community as they are fearful of the rules and oppression from outside their community. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about how people are converting. I mean, I remember, I was one of those people, allow me to date myself here. I was one of the cheerleaders for Fidel Castro back in the days, and I remember my high school teacher talking about Fidel Castro. But the argument was, in that case, people were being drawn to communism and socialism because the Catholic Church had failed them. And in communities where we're seeing, go to ISIS, for example, where we're seeing people go to ISIS, they're often going to ISIS from communities that have failed them. Where, there's got to be some part of their mind that says, I'm signing my death warrant to go to Raqqa or Mosul and fight in this war. And, for me, we have to think about what is it that makes them so desperate that they're willing to give up whatever they have, however much of a struggle it is, to go off and do this. And so when we see people being drawn to rules rather than to beauty, when we see them being drawn to a cult rather than being drawn to a community of love, we need to step back as the sort of adults in the room and say, what's going on here? What are we doing to our country or to our people or to our young people that makes them as desperate as they are?
Yes, I have a question. My name is Aaron. I live here in Portsmouth, Haroun, Arabia. I'd like to say, first of all, that as a Baha'i, I have the responsibility, as outlined by Shoghi Effendi, one of the central figures of the Baha'i faith, to speak up on behalf of Islam and to refute any attacks against it. And so I've been doing that online. And one of the things that, a question or a comment that keeps coming up on the internet, in these forums that I engage in, is regarding the Shahada, which goes, La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah. That first part, La ilaha illallah. Could you deconstruct that for us in order to maybe help dispel the misconceptions that people have about Allah versus God.
Allow me, first of all, to say that we're all thankful for the support of Baha'is, and I think we all equally condemn those places like Iran where Baha'is are being persecuted, in the name of any form or understanding of religion. Secondly, I'll let my brothers and sisters, if they want to, I would only say that when we say, there is no God but God, Allah is merely the Arabic iteration of the word God, and there's no differentiation between the, if you're French, you say Dieu, if you're English, you say God, and if you're Arab speaker, or you're saying your prayers in Arabic, you say Allah.
Thank you. I know this may sound a little ridiculous, but I hope not. With Trump shining a light on, all the stuff that's been going on, and being a local activist, and people saying, what can we do? What can we do? So the big question I would ask to you, what can we do, should things get worse, God forbid? What can we do if they say, all right, all Muslims need to register? Do we all register? I don't want to make assumptions about a faith that is not mine, but I want you to know that there are so many of us, and I think you know that especially in this room, that feel strongly that you have every right to practice what you practice. And Robert, I want to thank you for bringing up, waking up in the morning and say, please not be a Christian, because that infuriates me when I talk to even my own mother. Well, they all want to kill us. It's all about jihad. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about. So what can we do, I guess?
Sure, everyone.
He wants to.
Well, I think we all have a view here.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. In addition to continuing to talk to your mother,
Yeah.
right?
That was a great question. Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it shows that you care, and we really deeply appreciate that. I'll tell you right now, again, with all the negativity and all of the things that go on, I try to stay optimistic, and what brings me a lot of optimism is seeing not just Muslims standing up and being strong. I expect that. It's the non-Muslims and joining with us in solidarity for human rights. And, keeping that basic tenet and remembering what America is all about. I mean, I think we all know that's how we started this revolution, and how the revolution started for us to be a country. Some of the biggest things was taxation and religious freedom. So if we're getting away from our basic, beliefs as a country, then there's a big problem. And what we can do is exactly what we're doing right now. That's one of the biggest things. And I really feel a lot of, pride as an American right now. Of course, I'm saddened by the bigotry and stuff like that, but the reaction has been even greater, and I love it. And I love that we're awake, and I love that everybody is becoming active, and I feel great that, for instance, with the Muslim ban, which I call it a Muslim ban, because just like they say, why don't you call it Islamic terrorism? Why don't you call it Christian terrorism? Why are you calling it a travel ban? These are all the subtle things that they do to try to change our psyche. It's a Muslim ban, bottom line. But with that, we saw this government at, I think, one of its finest moments. The fact that what we learned in social studies is true. There are checks and balances, and we don't have a dictator. And as much as this guy might want to be Putin or Kim Jong-un, he can't be. He won't be. And that makes me feel a lot of hope. And I love that we can open our mouths and that we're not going to be, stifled, and we're allowed to speak up. And that is, I think, the biggest things that we can do and we are doing. And let's just continue to do that and continue to fight peacefully. And I say that because let's not fall into what we're accusing those people of doing to us. We have to show them the best example of what we say you should be doing. So let's continue with that. I think that's the biggest things we can do.
Thank you.
You know, if there becomes a Muslim registry, I think the woman next to you, the person sitting next to you said, you know, go register. I think that's legit. I think that's, I mean, I think that education is important. Any kind of dialogue is important so that we can understand the things that make us similar and the things that make us different, and have more respect for that. But when it comes time for action, you know, I think it is important, those of us who have any kind of privilege, to figure out how to use that to help those who do not. I think we should listen to the leadership of people from those, from whatever community is being targeted. So, you know, rather than, so I have friends who, not here, but on the West Coast, who wanted to do, what is it called, like, do a day where they wore hijab or whatever. And I find that problematic, and so do lots of Muslim women who wear hijab, right? So in that moment, there's a teaching in that moment, right? If you talk to the people and you listen to the people who wear hijab, they might tell you that explain all the reasons why it's a problem to, you know, put on religious garb as if it's a costume or something, you know, and that doesn't actually make any Muslim woman who's wearing hijab any safer. So listen to those people. Support Muslim-led initiatives. I don't know what's happening here in Portsmouth, but there are, yeah.
This is happening.
Oh, okay. Well, in Portland, there are lots of Muslim businesses. You know, lots of Muslim-run organizations. If you don't want to engage in, like, you know, capitalist endeavors by, you know, giving money to businesses, you can support other kinds of efforts. But I think all of those things are important, and to continue to show up like you did today.
Thank you.
I want to move it a little bit further than what someone said. I think if you're a Christian, you have to call out your Christian clergy to lead. If you're Jewish, you have to call out your Jewish clergy to lead. This isn't just about Muslims. If it becomes just about Muslims and they succeed, you're next. In the 17th and 18th century, there were mostly Methodist ministers. They were itinerant ministers, and they rode from village to village and throughout New England, and I think in other parts, because the towns couldn't afford a full-time minister in their churches, so they sort of rode from horseback, on horseback from village to village, and they got fed, and they gave a sermon, they got fed, and then he moved on again. And so there's this, you know, and I think in some ways we're reviving that tradition. You know, you're coming down from Portland, and you're coming over from Manchester. You know, if you want to act in solidarity, you can sort of become like itinerant Muslims, but you can be itinerant Christians and Jews, but call your clergy and say this is unacceptable, because the people that are driving these restrictions on Muslims, and yes, it is a Muslim ban, you know, it's a clear, and yes, there will be a registry of one sort or another, and I urge you to sign it. I do urge you, as someone said, not to appropriate Islamic garb as your own, because you'll never get it right anyway. But it's the clergy that matters. It's the moral and spiritual leadership of this country that is committed, that needs to be committed to what their foundational principles are. And you have to hold them accountable to that, and that is that, you know, we're a nation of brothers and sisters under one God, and that's what we are.
Thank you.
Oh,
a couple more questions?
Can I add one more thing to that? One more thing. I think one more concrete thing is to figure out how to be an active bystander. And this, so when you see something happening, doing any kind of training to help you figure out how to be an active bystander will help you move out of that moment of witnessing something to acting. Because I think so many of us want to believe, I know myself included, want to believe that if I am seeing someone who is, being a woman who is being catcalled in the street, that I'm going to say and do something. But if I don't have any kind of training that's going to prepare me to say and do something, then odds are that I may not, and then regret later on. So there are lots of like empowerment, self-defense, or active bystander kind of classes that you can take that will help you figure out what to say and do in those moments.
Actually, this is a chick question. How come you have a hubby, John, and you don't? If you're both Muslim.
I would let her lead first.
So it's hijab, Hijab, hijab. I will say that there are verses in the Quran that talk about modesty, and those verses are open to interpretation. So some Muslim women feel as if the translations of the verse require that you cover your hair and your whatever is your the sexual parts of your body, right? Some other women will read modesty as just dress modestly. I think that for me, it's a personal choice. For me, this is I was raised wearing hijab. I was raised as a young person when I hit puberty to wear hijab. But I had a moment where, as I left the house, as I left my parents' house, I could decide which felt best for me, which felt like it was the best way for me to practice my faith, and this is what I chose. I need to say that doesn't, to me, that doesn't, whether or not a Muslim woman wears or doesn't wear hijab or however she dresses, does not, to me, have any kind of indication of her level of religiosity. I have no idea. As Robert said, I just forgot your name, I'm sorry. As Robert said, there, all throughout the Quran it talks about how we are not to judge. It's not my place. And I firmly believe that wearing hijab is my choice and has no bearing on someone else's reaction to me. I know I'm going back to what you said. You have what you do and do not wear has nothing to do with men's erection. That is about their inability to control desire. There's this great poem by Moja Kaf. She's a Syrian American poet. She writes these beautiful poems. There's a series of hijab poems. I'll spell her name for you or I can give it to you afterwards if you want. And one of her poems, I don't think it's one of the hijab poems, but one of her poems, she talks about her body as a woman and her hair, and she says things like, this is not verbatim, but my hair will or will not cause wars. You know what I mean? This is the wars that are fought. And are not about whether or not I cover or don't cover my hair. It's about patriarchy. It's about oppression, and it's about violence. So yeah, for me, it's a very personal choice, and it is. It connects me to my faith.
So it's not part of your religious rule? Is it? I mean, okay, I'm sorry.
It's not. You said it's not, or it is. Did you answer that?
Yeah. So just like any other faith, there are a lot of interpretations. So there's a verse in the Quran that talks about modesty, and lots of people interpret it very differently. For me, my personal interpretation is that I believe that I am required to wear hijab. That is my personal interpretation.
And that's the key point. It's the personal interpretation. The different interpretation and the different say about covering for women, that's because the sexual appearance. And I think there is many men that are attractive there and we like them, right? So why they're not covered? It goes two ways, right? So if my appearance, it's cause somebody for him to have a sexual desire on me, I don't have a sexual desire on men if I'm a heterosexual, you know? So it's a personal choice and personal interpretation. I believe that I don't have to cover to practice my religion. And the interpretations that some people who are covered saying that's because we have, to cover, or because we arouse men, or we get their sexual desire. That's exactly if you say to a woman that she was wearing shorts and she went to party or whatever and get raped, and then we blame her and we say what she was wearing. So it's, and no surprise that I work in a domestic violence unit, right?
Thank you. It's great. All right, one more question and then we'll head back to the panel.
I have a question that probably I would assume would be something that might be continue at another time in terms of a discussion. And to go a little bit further, the questions we just heard previously. How and what do we do to connect and interact and educate our youth today? Because if we are not talking about this in the classroom, we're talking about the next future generation who are going to continue carrying these same understandings and misunderstandings. And I think it's a critical thing that we need to do. And I've been a teacher for many years, and there are many students who do not understand and who have as many, if not 100 more questions than we have in this room. So I would like, in just your opinion, how do we go about or begin to educate and connect with youth in our country who are totally ignorant about most of this?
I think education, and we always, we gather, but it's a good thing that we are encouraging youth and young people to come to this, to be part of this, because this is where the knowledge is, the history and the experience, and that's where you learn from. I think for me growing up, in a big family and with my grandparents and aunts and uncles and that, I learned a lot from them because they already walked that walk. So I think we need to encourage them to be in the table and talk to them. And, there is many information out there that could not be, the right information, especially online and on the media and so on. But also youth are very connected to each other. And I don't think, in their school with other students, and so they see religion. They see their friends and they see the humanity. And I think that's what it is. We see each other as a human being and we interact with each other as a human being. And then my religions and what I do to my God and Allah and, whoever, that's mine. And I think we need to practice that, and they will see that. And, as we say, they do what they say we do, not what we say.
Okay, I have time to add to that?
Sure.
My daughter, who's pursuing a PhD program, and it teaches me words like intersectionality, which I love, although I resisted for about a month using it, but it became so appropriate that I finally gave in. She calls me now a professional other. And by that, she means it with some approval. For example, in the rest of this month, I'm going to be both preaching and doing an Ask a Muslim program at a UCC church, at a UU church. I'm going to be visiting a retirement community, 2 high schools, speaking to the Sisters of Mercy in Manchester, and 2 elementary schools. No. It's the parent, I don't know where you are sitting, who asked that question. All right. I just wanted to look in your general direction. Thank you. In part, I think it's the children that have the biases of the parents. They hear it at home. If the parents are reading Breitbart, the kids are getting Breitbart. If they're watching Fox, they're getting Fox. If they're watching Rachel Maddow, they're on the right path. But the kids, we need to get all of us in schools. I mean, it's not just to say we need more civics, which we do in school, that we need more understanding of American history. We need to be able to understand each other's doctrines and religions, and to understand that this was a country in which the founding documents encourage. I mean, it was that wonderful slaveholder, Richard Henry Lee, who talked that this couldn't be a complete country unless it included the Hindu and the Mohammedan. But, you know, he also had like 350 slaves that he owned. But the point is, we have to start with the children, and by starting with the children, it means they just not get taught about Islam and Muslims by people who aren't Muslim. They just have to meet them. I don't know a mosque in New Hampshire or Massachusetts that would not welcome you into their mosque for the Friday prayers. Yeah.
We have an open house on Sunday.
In Nashville, there's an open house on Sundays, I understand. I may come down.
Everybody's welcome.
But on the other hand, when there were some stones thrown through the mosque windows in Nashville, only one newspaper in the state carried it. When there was vandalism at the Manchester Mosque, only one paper carried it. So not only do we need to express our willingness to engage and embrace the other, but we've got to hold our own institutions accountable. You know, why aren't you doing something about this? Why are we letting these people in Manchester spend 7 years, you know, trying to build a mosque, and every time they add a brick, somebody, you know, issues a lawsuit against them? It's a real challenge, but it's not just the Muslims I know, and I didn't meet my brothers and sisters here today until I got here at 10 minutes of 2, but there's not a person here that I wouldn't invite to come into my home or into your homes and say, this is who we are. And what you find out is we're just like you. You know? There's not much that makes us different.